Desperation, Part 1, Chapter 5. Chapter 5, Section 1. David Carver saw it while the woman in the blue shirt and faded jeans was finally giving up, huddling back against the bars of the drunk tank and holding her forearms protectively against her breasts as the cop pulled the desk away so he could get at her. "Don't touch it," the white-haired man had said when the woman threw the shotgun down and it came clattering across the hardwood floor to bang off the bars of David's cell. "Don't touch it. It's empty. Just leave it alone." He had done what the man said, but he had seen something else on the floor when he looked down at the shotgun, one of the shells that had fallen off the desk. It was lying on its side against the far left-hand vertical bar of his cell. Fat green shotgun shell, maybe one of a dozen that had gone rolling every which way when the crazy cop had started battering the woman, Mary, with the desk and the chair in order to make her drop the gun. The old guy was right. It would make no sense to go grabbing for the shotgun. Even if he could also get the shell, it would make no sense to do that. The cop was big, tall as a pro basketball player, broad as a pro football player, and the cop was also fast. He'd be on David, who had never held a real gun in his life, before David could even figure out what hole the shell went in. But if he should get a chance to pick up the shell, maybe, well, who knew? "Can you walk?" the cop was asking the woman named Mary. His tone was grotesquely solicitous. "Is anything broken?" "What difference does it make?" Her voice was trembling, but David thought it was rage making that tremble, not fear. "Kill me if you're going to. Get it over with." David glanced at the old guy who was in the cell with him, wanting to see if the old guy had also noticed the shell. So far as David could tell, he hadn't, although he had finally gotten off the bunk and come to the cell bars. Instead of yelling at the woman who had tried her very best to blow his head off, or maybe hurting her for it, the cop gave her a brief one-armed hug, a pal's hug. In a way, David found this seemingly sincere little gesture of affection more unsettling than all the violence which had come before it. "I'm not going to kill you, Mayor." The cop looked around as if to ask the remaining 3 Carvers, and the white-haired guy if they could believe this crazy lady. His bright gray eyes met David's blue ones, and the boy took an unplanned step back from the bars. He felt suddenly weak with horror and vulnerable. How he could feel more vulnerable than he already was, he didn't know, but he did. The cop's eyes were empty, so empty that it was almost as if he were unconscious with them open. This made David think of his friend Brian and his one memorable visit to Brian's hospital room last November. But it wasn't the same, because at the same time the cop's eyes were empty, they weren't. There was something there, yes, something. And David didn't know what it was, or how it could be both something and nothing. He only knew he had never seen anything like it. The cop looked back at the woman called Mary with an expression of exaggerated astonishment. "Gosh, no," he said. "Not when things are just getting interesting." He reached into his right front pocket, brought out a ring of keys, and selected one that hardly looked like a key at all. It was square with the black strip embedded in the center of the metal. To David, it looked a little like a hotel key card. He poked this into the lock of the big cell and opened it. "Hop in, Mare," he said, "snug as a bug in a rug. That's what you'll be." She ignored him, looking instead at David's parents. They were standing together at the bars of the little cell. Directly across from the one David was sharing with white-haired Mr. Silent. "This man, this maniac, killed my husband, She swallowed, grimacing, and the big cop looked at her benignly, seeming almost to smile encouragement. "Get this out, Mary. Sick it up. You'll feel better when you do." Put his arm around him like he did me just now, and shot him 4 times. "He killed our little girl," Ellen Carver told her, and something in her tone struck David with a moment of utter, dreamlike unreality. It was as if the two of them were playing Can You Top This? Next, a woman named Mary would say, "Well, he killed our dog," and then his mother would say, "We don't know that," David's father said. He looked horrible, face swollen and bloody, like a heavyweight boxer who has taken 12 full rounds of punishment. Not for sure. He looked at the cop, a terrible expression of hope in his swollen face. But the cop ignored him. It was Mary he was interested in. "That's enough chit-chat," he said. He sounded like the world's kindliest grandpa. "Hop into your room, Mary mine, into your gilded cage, my little blue-eyed parakeet." "Or what, you'll kill me?" "I already told you I won't," he said in that same kind old Gramps voice. "But you don't want to forget the world-renowned fate worse than death." His voice hadn't changed, but she was now looking up at him raptly, like a staked goat at an approaching boa constrictor. "I can hurt you, Mary," he said. "I can hurt you so badly you'll wish I had killed you. Now, you believe that, don't you?" She looked at him a moment longer, then tore her eyes away. And that was just what it felt like to David from his place 20 feet away. Her pulling free, the way you'd pull a piece of tape off the flap of a letter or a package, and walked into the cell. Her face shivered as she went, then broke apart as the cop slammed the cell's barred door behind her. She threw herself onto one of the 4 bunks at the rear, put her face into her arms, and began to sob. The cop stood watching her for a moment, head lowered. David had time to look down at the shotgun shell again and think about grabbing it. Then the big cop jerked and kind of shook himself like someone waking from a doze, and turned away from the cell with the sobbing woman in it. He walked across to where David was standing. The white-haired man retreated rapidly from the bars as the cop came, until the backs of his knees struck the edge of the bunk and he folded down into a sitting position. Then he put his hands over his eyes again. Before, that had seemed like a gesture of despair to David, but now it seemed to echo the horror he himself had felt when the cop's stare had fallen upon him. Not despair, but the instinctive hiding gesture of someone who will not look at a thing unless absolutely forced to look. "How's it going, Tom?" the cop asked the man on the bunk. "How the hangin', old-timer?" Mr. Whitehair shrank away from the sound of the voice without taking his hands away from his eyes. The cop looked at him a moment longer, then turned his gray gaze on David again. David found he couldn't look away, and now it was his eyes that had been taped. And there was something else, wasn't there? A sense of being called. Having fun, David? The big blonde cop asked. His eyes seemed to be expanding, turning into bright gray ponds filled with light. Are you feeling this interlude, measure for measure? It came out a dusty croak. He licked his lips and tried again. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? I wonder about that, because I see... He raised one hand to the corner of his mouth, touched it, then dropped it again. The expression on his face seemed to be one of genuine puzzlement. I don't know what I see. It's a question. Yes, sir, it is. Who are you, boy? David glanced quickly at his mother and father and could not look for long at what he saw in their faces. They thought the cop was going to kill him, as he had killed Pye and Mary's husband. He turned his eyes back at the cop. I'm David Carver, he said. I live at 248 Poplar Street in Wentworth, Ohio. Yes, I'm sure that's true, but little Dave, who made thee? Canst thou say who made thee? Talk! He's not reading my mind, David thought, but I think maybe he could if he wanted to. An adult would likely have admonished himself for such a thought, told himself not to be silly, not to succumb to fear-driven paranoia. That's just what he wants you to believe, that he's a mind reader. The adult would think, but David wasn't a man. He was a boy of 11, not just any boy of 11 either, not since last November. There had been some big changes since then. He could only hope they would help him deal with what he was seeing and experiencing now. The cop, meanwhile, was looking at him with narrowed, considering eyes. I guess my mother and father made me, David said. Isn't that the way it works? A boy who understands the birds and the bees. Wonderful. And what about my other question? Trooper, are you having any fun? You killed my sister, so don't ask stupid questions. Son, don't provoke him, his father called in a high, scared voice. It didn't really sound like his father at all. Oh, I'm not stupid, the cop said, bending that horrid gray gaze even more closely on David. The irises actually seemed to be in motion, turning and turning like pinwheels. Looking at them made David feel nauseated, close to vomiting, but he couldn't look away. I may be a lot of things, but stupid isn't one of them. I know a lot, Trooper, I do. I know a lot. Leave him alone, David's mother screamed. David couldn't see her. The cop's bulk blocked her out entirely. Haven't you done enough to our family? If you touch him, I'll kill you. The cop paid no notice. He raised his index fingers to his lower lids and pulled them down, making the eyeballs themselves bulge out grotesquely. I've got eagle eyes, David, and those are eyes that see the truth from afar. You just want to believe that. Eagle eyes, yes, sir. The cop continued to stare through the bars, and now it was almost as if 11-year-old David Carter had hypnotized him. You're quite a one, aren't you? The cop breathed. You're quite a one indeed. Yes, I think so. Think whatever you want. Just don't think about me thinking about the shotgun shell. The cop's eyes widened slightly, and for a hideous moment, David thought that was exactly what the cop was thinking about. That he had tuned into David's mind as if it were a radio signal. Then a coyote howled outside, a long, lonely sound, and the cop glanced in that direction. The thread between them, maybe telepathy, maybe just a combination of fear and fascination, snapped. The cop bent to pick up the shotgun. David held his breath, fully expecting him to see the shell lying on the floor off to his right, but the cop did not glance in that direction. He stood up, flipping a lever on the side of the shotgun as he did so. It broke open, the barrels lying over his arm like an obedient animal. "Don't go away, David," he said in a confidential, just disguised voice. "We've got a lot to talk about. That's a conversation I'm looking forward to, believe me, but just now I'm a little busy." He walked back toward the center of the room, head down, picking up shells as he went. The first 2 he loaded into the gun, the rest he stuffed absently into his pockets. David dared wait no longer. He bent, snaked his hand between the 2 bars on the left side of the cell, and grabbed the fat green tube. He slipped it into the pocket of his jeans. The woman named Mary didn't see she was still lying on the bunk with her face buried in her arms, sobbing. His parents didn't see. They were standing at the bars of their cell, arms around each other's waists, watching the man in the khaki uniform with horrified fascination. David turned around and saw that old Mr. Whitehair, Tom, still had his hands to his face, so maybe that was okay too. Except old Tom's watery eyes were open behind his fingers. David could see them, so maybe it wasn't okay. Either way, it was too late now to take it back. Still facing the man the cop had called Tom, David raised the side of one hand to his mouth in a brief shushing gesture. Old Tom gave no sign that he saw. His eyes in their own prison only continued to stare out from between the bars of his fingers. The cop who had killed Pi picked up the last shell on the floor, took a brief look under the desk, then straightened and snapped the shotgun closed with a single flick of his wrist. David had watched him closely through the picking up process, trying to get a sense of whether or not the cop was counting the shells. He hadn't thought so until now. Now the cop was just standing there, back to, head down. Then he turned and strode back to David's cell, and the boy felt his stomach turn to lead. For a moment, the cop just stood there looking at him, seeming to pry at him, and David thought, he's trying to pick my brains the way a burglar tries to pick a lock. "Are you thinking about God?" the cop asked. "Don't bother. Out here, God's country stops at Indian Springs, and even Lord Satan don't step his cloven feet much north of Tonopah. There's no God in Desperation, baby boy. Out here, there's only Can de Lach." That seemed to be it. The cop walked out of the room with the shotgun now riding under his arm. There were perhaps 5 seconds of silence in the holding area, broken only by the muffled sobs of the woman named Mary. David looked at his parents, and they looked back at him, standing that way with their arms around each other. He could see how they must have looked as small children. Long before they met each other at Ohio Wesleyan, and this frightened him out of all measure. He would rather have come upon them naked and fucking. He wanted to break the silence, couldn't think how. Then the cop suddenly sprang back into the room. He had to duck his head to keep from bumping it on the top of the doorway. He was grinning in a mad way that made David think of Garfield, the comic strip cat, when Garfield did his impromptu back fence vaudeville routines, which this was, it seemed. There was an old telephone hung on the wall, its beige plastic casing cracked and filthy. The cop snatched it off its hook, held it to his ear, and cried, "Room service! Send me up a room!" He slammed the phone back down and turned his mad Garfield grin on his prisoners. Old Jerry Lewis bit, he said. American critics don't understand Jerry Lewis, but he's huge in France. I mean, he's a stud. He looked at David. No God in France either, trooper. Take it from moi. Just Cinzano, Cinzano, and escargot, and women who don't shave their armpits. He flashed the others with his regard, the grin fading as he did so. You people have to stay put, he said. I know that you're scared of me, and maybe you're right to be scared, but you're locked up for a reason, believe it. This is the only safe place for miles around. There are forces out there you don't want to even think about, and when tonight comes... He only looked at them and shook his head somberly, as if the rest was too awful to be spoken aloud. You lie. You liar, David thought. But then another howl drifted through the open window in the stairwell, and he wondered. In any case, the cop said, these are good locks and good cells. They were built by hard asses for roughneck miners, and escape's not an option. If that's been in your mind, send it home to its mama. You mind me now? It's the best thing to do. Believe me, it is. Then he was gone, this time for real. David could hear his booted feet thudding down the stairs, shaking the whole building. The boy stood where he was for a moment, knowing what he had to do now. Absolutely had to do, but reluctant to do it in front of his parents. Still, there was no choice, was there? And he had been right about the cop. The big man hadn't exactly been reading his mind like it was a newspaper, but he'd been getting some of it. He'd been getting the God stuff, but maybe that was good. Better the cop should see God than the shotgun shell. Maybe. He turned and took 2 slow steps to the foot of the bunk. He could feel the weight of the shell in his pocket as he went. That weight was very clear, very distinct. It was as if he had a lump of gold hidden in there. No, more dangerous than gold. A chunk of something radioactive, maybe. He stood where he was for a moment, back to the room, and then, very slowly, sank down on his knees. He took a deep breath, pulling in air until his lungs would absolutely hold no more, then let it out again in a long, silent whoosh. He folded his hands on the rough woolen blanket, dropped his forehead softly onto them. David, what's wrong with you? His mother called. David! There isn't anything wrong with him, his father said, and David smiled a little as he closed his eyes. What do you mean, nothing wrong? Ellie screamed. Look at him, he fell down. He's fainting. David! Their voices were distant now, fading, but before they went out entirely, he heard his dad say, not fainting, praying. No God in desperation. Well, let's just see about that. Then he was gone. No longer concerned about what his parents might be thinking. No longer worried that old Mr. Whitehair might have seen him filch the shotgun shell and might tell the monster cop what he had seen. No longer grieving for sweet little Pie, who had never hurt anyone in her life and hadn't deserved to die as she had. He was not, in fact, precisely even inside his own head anymore. He was in the black now, blind but not deaf, in the black and listening for his God. Chapter 5, Section 2. Like most spiritual conversions, David Carver's was dramatic only on the outside. On the inside, it was quiet, almost mundane. Not rational, perhaps. Matters of the spirit may never be strictly rational, but possessed of its own clarity and logic. And to David, at least, its genuineness was beyond question. He had found God, that was all. And, parentheses, as he considered probably more important, close parentheses, God had found him. In November of the previous year, David's best friend had been struck by a car while riding his bike to school. Brian Ross was thrown 20 feet into the side of a house. On any other morning, David would have been with him, but on that particular day, he had stayed home sick, nursing a not too serious virus. The phone had rung at 8:30, and his mother had come into the living room 10 minutes later, pale and trembling. David, something's happened to Brian. Please try not to be too upset. After that, he didn't remember much of the conversation. Only the words, not expected to live. It had been his idea to go and see Brian in the hospital the next day. After calling the hospital all on his own that evening and ascertaining that his friend was still alive. Honey, I understand how you feel, but that's a really bad idea, his father had said. His use of honey, a term of endearment long since retired, along with David's stuffed toys, indicated how upset Ralph Carver was. He had looked at Ellen, but she only stood by the sink, wringing a dishcloth nervously back and forth in her hands. Obviously, no help there. Not that Ralph had felt very helpful himself, heavens knew. But who had ever expected such a conversation? My gosh, the boy was only 11. Ralph hadn't even gotten around to telling him the facts of life, let alone those of death. Thank goodness Kirsty was in the other room, watching cartoons on TV. No, David had said, it's a good idea. In fact, it's the only idea. He thought of adding something heroically modest, like, besides Brian would do it for me, and decided not to. He didn't think Brian would do it for him, actually. That didn't change anything, though, because he had vaguely understood even then, before what had happened in Bear Street Woods, that he'd be going not for Brian, but for himself. His mother had advanced a few hesitant steps from her bastion by the sink. David, you've got the dearest heart in the world, the kindest heart in the world, but Brian, he was, well, thrown. What she's trying to say is that he hit a brick wall head first, his father said. He had reached across the table and taken one of his son's hands. There was extensive brain damage. He's in a coma, and there are no good vital signs. Do you know what that means? That they think his brain turned into a cabbage. Ralph had winced, then nodded. He's in a situation where the best thing that could happen would be for it to end fast. If you went to see him, you wouldn't be seeing the friend you know, the one you used to have sleepovers with. His mother had gone into the living room at that point, had swept the bewildered pie into her lap, and begun to cry again. David's father glanced after her as if he'd like to join her, then turned back to David again. It's best if you remember Bri the way he was when you saw him the last time. Understand? Yes, but I can't do that. I have to go see him. If you don't want to take me, that's okay, though. I'll take the bus after school. Ralph had sighed heavily. Shit, kid, I'll take you. You won't have to wait until after school, either. Just don't, for gosh sake, say anything about this to... He lifted his chin toward the living room. To Pi. Gosh, no. He didn't add that Pi had already been into his room to ask him what had happened to Brian, and had it hurt, and what did David think it was like to die? Did you go somewhere? And about 100 other questions. Her face had been so solemn, so attentive. She'd been absolutely pie-eyed. But it was often best if you didn't tell your parents everything. They were old and stuff got on their nerves. Brian's parents won't let you in, Ellie had said, coming back into the room. I've known Mark and Debbie for years. They're grief-stricken, sure they are. If it had been you, I'd be insane. But they'll know better than to let a little boy look at another little boy who's dying. I called them after I called the hospital and asked if I could come see him, David said quickly. Mrs. Ross said okay. His dad was still holding his hand. That was okay. He loved his mom and dad very much and had been sorry this was distressing for them, but there was no question in his mind about what he was supposed to do. It had been as if some other power, one from outside, were guiding him even then. The way an older, smarter person might guide a little kid's hand to help him make a picture of a dog or a chicken or a snowman. What's the matter with her? Ellen Carver asked in a distraught voice. Just what in the hell's the matter with her? That's what I'd like to know. She said she was glad I could come say goodbye. She said they're going to turn off the life support stuff this weekend after his grandparents come to say goodbye, and she was glad I could come first. The following day, Ralph took the afternoon off from work and picked his son up at school. David had been standing at the curb with his blue excused early pass sticking out of his shirt pocket. When they got to the hospital, they rode up to the 5th floor ICU in the world's slowest elevator. On the way, David tried to prepare himself for what he was going to see. Don't be shocked, David, Mrs. Ross had said on the phone. He doesn't look very nice. We're sure he doesn't feel any pain. He's down much too deep for that, but he doesn't look very nice. Want me to come in with you? His father had asked, outside the door of the room Brian was in. David had shaken his head. He was still powerfully in the grip of the feeling which had more or less swallowed him since his pallid mother had given him the news about the accident. That feeling of being guided by someone more experienced than he was. Someone who would be brave for him if his own courage faltered. He had gone into the room. Mr. and Mrs. Ross were there, sitting in red vinyl chairs. They had books in their hands that they weren't reading. Brian was in the bed by the window, surrounded by equipment that beeped and sent green lines rolling across video screens. A light blanket was pulled up to his waist. Above it, a thin white hospital shirt lay open like cheesy school play angel's wings on either side of his chest. There were all sorts of rubber suckers on him down there, and more attached to his head, below a vast white cap of bandage. From beneath this cap, one long cut descended Brian's left cheek to the corner of his mouth where it curved up like a fish hook. The cut had been sutured with black thread. To David, it had looked like something out of a Frankenstein movie. One of the old ones with Boris Karloff they showed on Saturday nights. Sometimes when he slept over at Brian's, the two of them stayed up and ate popcorn and watched those movies. They loved the old black and white monsters. Once during the mommy, Brian had turned to David and said, "Oh shit, the mommy's after us. Let's all walk a little faster." Stupid, but at 1:45 in the morning, anything can strike 11-year-olds funny. And the two of them had laughed like fiends. Brian's eyes had looked up at him from the hospital bed and through him. They were open and as empty as school classrooms in August. Feeling more than ever as if he were not moving but being moved, David had walked into the magic circle of the machines. He observed the suction cups in Brian's chest and temples. He observed the wires coming out of the suction cups. He observed the oddly misshapen look of the helmet-sized bandage on the left side of Brian's head, as if the shape beneath it had been radically changed. David supposed it had been. When you hit the side of a brick house, something had to give. There was a tube in Brian's right arm and another coming out of his chest. The tubes went to bags of liquid hanging off poles. There was a plastic doodad in Brian's nose and a band on his wrist. David thought, these are the machines that are keeping him alive, and when they turn them off, when they pull out the needles... Disbelief filled him at the idea. Buds of wonder, which were only grief, rolled tight. He and Brian squirted each other at the water fountain outside their homeroom at school whenever they thought they could get away with it. They rode their bikes in the fabled Bear Street woods, pretending they were commandos. They swapped books and comics and baseball cards and sometimes just sat on David's back porch, playing with Brian's Game Boy or reading and drinking David's mom's lemonade. They slapped each other high fives and called each other bad boy. Parentheses, sometimes when it was just the two of them, they called each other fuckhead or dickweed. Close parentheses. In the second grade, they'd pricked their fingers with pins and smushed them together and sworn themselves blood brothers. In August of this year, they had made, with Mark Ross's help, a bottle cap Parthenon from a picture in a book. It turned out not so well that Mark kept it in the downstairs hall and showed it to... It turned out so well that Mark kept it in the downstairs hall and showed it to company. At the first of the year, the bottle cap Parthenon was slated to travel the block and a half to the Carver house. It was the Parthenon that David's mind had fixed upon most firmly as he stood by his comatose friend's bed. They had built it, him, Brian, Brian's dad, out in the Ross garage while the tape player endlessly recycled Rattle and Hum on the shelf behind them. A silly thing because it was just bottle caps. Cool thing because it looked like what it was supposed to look like. You could tell what it was. Also a cool thing because they had made it with their own hands. And soon Brian's hands would be picked up and scrubbed by an undertaker who would use a special brush and pay particular attention to the fingernails. No one would want to look at a corpse with dirty nails, David supposed. And after Brian's hands were clean and he was in the coffin, his folks would pick out for him. The undertaker would lace his fingers together like they were a pair of sneakers, and that was how they'd stay, down in the ground, neatly folded, the way they had been supposed to fold their hands on their desks back in the second grade. No more bottle cap buildings for those hands. No more water fountain nozzles for those fingers. Down into the dark with them. It was not terror this thought had called up in his mind and heart, but despair. As if the image of Brian's fingers laced together in his coffin proved that nothing was worth anything. That doing never once in the world stopped dying. That not even kids were exempted from the horror show that roared on and on behind the peppermint sitcom facade your parents believed in and wanted you to believe in. Neither Mr. nor Mrs. Ross spoke to him as he stood by the bed, meditating on these things in the shorthand of children. And their silence was all right with David. He liked them just fine, especially Mr. Ross, who had a sort of interesting crazy streak, but he hadn't come here to see them. They weren't the ones with the food tubes and breathing machinery that were going to be taken away after the grandparents got a chance to say goodbye. He had come to see Brian. David had taken his friend's hand. It was astoundingly cool and lax in his own, but still alive. You could feel the life in it, running like a motor. He squeezed it gently and whispered, "How you doing, bad boy?" No response but the sound of the machine that was doing Brian's breathing for him, now that his brain had blown most of its fuses. This machine was at the head of the bed, and it was the biggest. It had a clear plastic tube mounted on one side of it. Inside the tube was something that looked like a white accordion. The sound this machine made was quiet. All the machines were quiet, but the accordion thing was unsettling just the same. It made a low, emphatic noise each time it went up, a gasping noise. It was as if part of Brian wasn't down too deep to feel pain, but that part had been taken out of his body and penned up in the plastic tube, where it was now being hurt even worse, where it was being pressed to death by the white accordion thing. And then there were the eyes. David felt his eyes drawn back to them again and again. Nobody had told him Brian's eyes would be open. Until just now, he hadn't known your eyes could be open when you were unconscious. Debbie Ross had told him not to be shocked that Brian didn't look very nice, but she hadn't told him about that stuffed moose stare. Maybe that was alright though. Maybe you could never be prepared about the really awful things, not at any age. One of Brian's eyes was bloodshot with a huge black pupil that ate up all but the thinnest ring of brown. The other was clear, and the pupil appeared to be normal, but nothing else was normal because there was no sign of his friend in those eyes. None. The boy who had cracked him up by saying, "Oh shit, the mummy's after us, let's all walk a little faster," wasn't here at all, unless he was in the plastic tube, at the mercy of the white accordion. David would look away at the stitched fishhook cut, at the bandage, at the one waxy ear he could see below the bandage, and then his gaze would wander back to Brian's open, staring eyes with their mismatched pupils. It was the nothing that drew him, the absence, the goneness in those eyes. It was more than wrong. It was evil. A voice deep in his head whispered. It was like no voice he had ever heard in his thoughts before. A total stranger. And when Debbie Ross's hand dropped on his shoulder, he'd had to clamp his lips together against a scream. "The man who did it was drunk," she said in a husky, tear-clouded voice. Fresh tears were rolling down her cheeks. "He says he doesn't remember any of it, that he was in a blackout. And you know the horrible thing, Davy? I believe him." Deb, Mr. Ross began, but Brian's mom took no notice of him. How could God let that man not remember hitting my son with his car? Her voice had begun to rise. Ralph Carter had poked his head around the edge of the open door, startled, and a nurse rolling a cart up the hall stopped dead in her tracks. She looked into room 508 with a pair of big blue oh goodness eyes. How could God be so merciful to someone who deserves to wake up screaming with memories of the blood coming out of my son's poor hurt head every night for the rest of his life? Mr. Ross put his arm around her shoulders. Outside the door, Ralph Carver pulled his head back like a turtle, withdrawing into its shell. David saw this and might have hated his dad a little for it. He couldn't remember for sure, one way or the other. What he remembered was looking down at Brian's pale, still face, with the misshapen bandage seeming to bear down on it, the waxy ear, the cut with its red lips drawn together in a smooch by the black thread, and the eyes. Most of all, what he remembered was the eyes. Brian's mother was right there, crying and screaming, and those eyes didn't change a bit. But he is in there, David thought, suddenly, and that thought, like so much that had happened to him since his mother had told him about Brian's accident, did not feel like something that was coming from him, but only something going through him, as if his mind and body had turned into some sort of pipe. He is in there, I know he is. Still in there, like someone caught in a landslide or a cave-in. Debbie Ross's control had given way entirely. She was almost howling, shaking in her husband's grip, trying to pull free. Mr. Ross got her headed back toward the red chairs, but it looked like a job. The nurse hurried in and slipped an arm around her waist. Mrs. Ross, sit down. You'll feel better if you do. What sort of God lets a man forget killing a little boy? Brian's mom had screamed. The kind that wants that man to get loaded and do it again, that's who. A God who loves drunks and hates little boys. Brian, looking up with his absent eyes, harking to his mother's sermon with the waxy ear, not noticing. Not here, but yes, was something whispered. Yes, he is somewhere. Nurse, can you give my wife a shot? Mr. Ross had asked, but then he was having a hard time keeping her from leaping back across the room and grabbing David, her son, maybe both of them. Something in her head had broken free. It was something that had a lot to say. I'll get Dr. Burgoyne. He's just up the hall. She hurried out. Brian's dad gave David a strained smile. There was sweat trickling down his cheeks and standing out on his forehead in a galaxy of fine dots. His eyes were red, and to David he looked like he had already lost weight. David didn't think such a thing was possible, but that was how he had looked. Mr. Ross now had one arm around his wife's waist and his other hand clamped on her shoulder. You have to go now, David, Mr. Ross said. He was trying not to pant and panting a little anyway. We're not doing so good. But I didn't say goodbye to him, David wanted to say, and then realized it wasn't sweat trickling down Mr. Ross's cheeks, but tears that got him moving. It wasn't until he got to the door and turned back and saw Mr. and Mrs. Ross had blurred into a whole crowd of parents that he realized he was shortly going to be crying himself. May I come back, Mr. Ross? He asked, in a cracked, shivery voice he barely recognized. Tomorrow, maybe? Mr. Ross had stopped struggling now. Mr. Ross's hands had ended up locked together just below her breasts, and her head was bent so her hair hung in her face. The way they looked made David think of the World Federation wrestling matches he and Bri had also sometimes watched, and how sometimes one guy would hug another guy like that. Oh shit, the mummy's after us, David thought for no good reason at all. Mr. Ross was shaking his head. I don't think so, Davy. But, no, I don't think so. You see, the doctors say there's no chance at all for Brian to... His face began to change as David had never seen an adult's face change. It seemed to be tearing itself apart from the inside. It was only later, out in the Bear Street woods, that he got a handle on it, sort of. He'd been seeing what happened when someone who hadn't cried in a long time, years maybe, finally couldn't hold back any longer. This was what it was like when the dam burst. Oh, my boy, Mr. Ross screamed. Oh, my boy. He let go of his wife and fell back against the wall between the two red vinyl chairs. He stood there for a moment, kind of leaning, then folded at the knees. He slid down the wall until he was sitting, hands held out toward the bed, cheeks wet, snot hanging from his nostrils, hair sticking up in the back, shirt tail out, pants pulled up so you could see the tops of his socks. He sat there like that and wailed. His wife knelt by him and took him in her arms as best she could, and that was when the doctor came in with the nurse right behind him. And when David slipped out, crying hard but trying not to sob. They were in a hospital, after all, and some people were trying to get well. His father was as pale as his mother had been when she told him about Brian, and when he took David's hand, his skin was much colder than Brian's had been. I'm sorry you had to see that, his father said, as they waited for the world's slowest elevator. David had an idea that it was all he could think of to say. On the ride home, Ralph Carver started to speak twice, then stopped. He turned on the radio, found an oldies station, then turned it down to ask David if he wanted an ice cream soda or anything. David shook his head, and his father turned the music up again, louder than ever. When they got home, David told his father he thought he'd shoot some baskets in the driveway. His father said that was fine and then hurried inside. As David stood behind the crack in the hot top that he used as a foul line, he heard his parents in the kitchen, their voices drifting out of an open window over the sink. She wanted to know what had happened, how David had taken it. Well, there was a scene, his father said, as though Brian's coma and approaching death were part of some play. David tuned out. That sense of otherness had come on him again. That feeling of being small, a part instead of a whole, someone else's business. He suddenly felt very strongly that he wanted to go down to the Bear Street woods, down to the little clearing. A path, narrow, but you could ride bikes along it if you were single file, led into this clearing. It was here, up in the Viet Cong lookout, that the boys had tried one of Debbie Ross's cigarettes the year before, and found it awful. Here that they had looked through their first copy of Penthouse. Parentheses, Brian had seen it lying on top of the dumpster, behind the Easy Stop 24 down the hill from his house. Close parentheses. Here that they had hung their feet down, and had their long conversations and dreamed their dreams, mostly about how they were going to be the kings of West Wentworth Middle School when they were ninth graders. It was here in the clearing you got to by way of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that the boys had most enjoyed their friendship, and it was here that David suddenly felt he had to go. He had bounced the ball with which he and Brian had played about 1 billion games of horse. One final time, bent his knees and shot. Swish, nothing but net. When the ball returned to him, he tossed it into the grass. His folks were still in the kitchen, their voices still droning out the open window. But David didn't even think about poking his head in and telling them where he was going. They might have forbidden him. Taking his bike never occurred to him. He walked head down the bright blue excused early pass still sticking out of his shirt pocket, although school was over for the day by then. The big yellow buses were rolling their homeward routes. Yelling flocks of little kids pounded past, waving their papers and lunch boxes. David took no notice. His mind was elsewhere. Later, Reverend Martin would tell him about the still small voice of God, and David would feel a tug of recognition, but it hadn't seemed like a voice then, or a thought, or even an intuition. The idea his mind kept returning to was how, when you were thirsty, your whole body cried for water, and how you would eventually lie down and drink from a mud puddle if that was all you could get. He came to Bear Street, then to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He walked slowly down it, his head still lowered so that he looked like a scholar with his mind on some immense problem. The Ho Chi Minh hadn't been his and Brian's exclusive property. Lots of kids ordinarily used it on their way to and from school. But no one had been on it that warm fall afternoon. It seemed to have been cleared especially for him. Halfway to the clearing, he spotted a Three Musketeers candy bar wrapper and picked it up. It was the only kind of candy bar Brian would eat, and he called them Three Muskies. And David had no doubt that Brian had dropped this one beside the path a day or two before the accident. Not that Brian was ordinarily a litter bug sort of guy. He'd stuff the wrapper in his pocket under ordinary circumstances, but maybe something made him drop it, something that knew I'd come along after that car hit him and threw him and broke his head on the brick, something that knew I'd find it and remember him. He told himself that was crazy, absolutely nutsoid, but maybe the nuttiest thing of all was that he didn't really think it was. Perhaps it would sound nutty if spoken aloud, but inside his head it seemed perfectly logical. With no thought of what he was doing, David stuck the red and silver wrapper into his mouth and sucked the little bits of sweet chocolate off the inside. He did this with his eyes closed and fresh tears squeezing out from under the lids. When the chocolate was all gone and there was nothing left but the taste of wet paper, he spat the wrapper out and went on his way. At the east edge of the clearing was an oak with 2 thick branches spreading out in a V about 20 feet up. The boys hadn't quite dared to go whole hog and build a treehouse in this beckoning fork. Someone might notice and make them tear it down again. But they had brought boards, hammers, and nails down here one summer day a year ago and made a platform that still remained. David and Brian knew that the high school kids sometimes used it. Parentheses, they'd found cigarette butts and beer cans on the weather-darkened old boards from time to time, and once a pair of pantyhose, close parentheses. But never until after dark, it seemed, and the idea of big kids using something they had made was actually sort of flattering. Also, the first handholds you had to grab in order to make the climb were high enough to discourage the little kids. David went up, cheeks wet, eyes swollen, still tasting chocolate and wet paper in his mouth, still hearing the gasp of the accordion thing in his ears. He felt he would find some other sign of Brian on the platform, like the Three Muskies wrapper on the path, but there was nothing. Just a sign nailed to the tree, the one that said Viet Cong Lookout, which they had put up a couple of weeks after completing the platform. The inspiration for that, parentheses, and for the name they'd given the path, close parentheses, was some old movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger in it. David didn't remember the name. He kept expecting to come up here someday and find that the big kids had pulled the sign down or spray painted something like "Suck my dick" on it, but none ever had. He guessed they must like it too. A breeze soughed through the trees, cooling his hot skin. Any other day, and Brian would have been sharing that breeze with him. They would have been dangling their feet, talking, laughing. David started to cry again. Why am I here? No answer. Why did I come? Did something make me come? No answer. If anyone's there, please answer. No answer for a long time. And then one did come, and he didn't think he was just talking to himself inside his own head. Then fooling himself about what he was doing in order to gain a little comfort. As when he had stood over Brian, the thought which came seemed in no way his own. Yes, this voice had said, I'm here. Who are you? Who I am, the voice said, and then fell silent, as if that actually explained something. David crossed his legs, sitting tailor fashion in the middle of the platform, and closed his eyes. He cupped his knees in his palms and opened his mind as best he could. He had no idea what else to do. In this fashion he waited for an unknown length of time, hearing the distant voices of the homegoing children, aware of shifting red and black shapes on the insides of his eyelids as the breeze moved the branches above him and dapples of sunlight slid back and forth on his face. Tell me what you want, he asked the voice. No answer. The voice didn't seem to want anything. Tell me what to do, then? No answer from the voice. Distant, he heard the sound of the firehouse whistle over on Columbus Broad. It was 5 o'clock. He'd been sitting up on the platform with his eyes closed for at least an hour, probably more like 2. His mom and dad would have noticed he was no longer in the driveway, would have seen the ball lying in the grass, would be worried. He loved them and didn't want to worry them. On some level, he understood that Brian's impending death had struck at them as hard as it had struck at him. But he couldn't go home yet because he wasn't done yet. Do you want me to pray? He asked the voice. I'll try if you want me to, but I don't know how. We don't go to church. And the voice overrode his, not angry, not amused, not impatient, not anything he could read. You're praying already, it said. What should I pray for? Oh shit, the mommy's after us, the voice said. Let's all walk a little faster. I don't know what that means. Yes, you do. No, I don't. Yes, I do, he said, almost moaned. Yes, I do. It means ask for what none of them dare to ask for. Pray for what none of them dare to pray for. Is that it? No answer from the voice. David opened his eyes, and the afternoon bombed him with late light, the red gold glow of November. His legs were numb from the knees down. He felt as if he had just awakened from a deep sleep. The day's simple, unzipped loveliness stunned him, and for a moment he was very aware of himself as a part of something whole, a cell in the living skin of the world. He lifted his hands from his knees, turned them over, and held them out. "Make him better," he said. "Gosh, make him better. If you do, I'll do something for you. I'll listen for what you want, and then I'll do it. I promise." He didn't close his eyes, but listened carefully, waiting to see if the voice had anything more to say. At first it seemed it did not. He lowered his hands, started to stand up, then winced at the burst of pins and needles that went whooshing up his legs from the balls of his feet. He even laughed a little. He grabbed a branch to steady himself, and as he was doing this, the voice did speak again. David listened, head cocked, still holding the branch, still feeling his muscles tingle crazily as the blood worked its way back into them. Then he nodded. They had put 3 nails into the trunk of the tree to hold the Viet Cong lookout sign. The wood had shrunk and warped since then, and the rusty heads of the nails stuck out. David took the blue pass with "excused early" printed on it from his shirt pocket and poked it onto one of the nail heads. That done, he marched in place until the tingling in his legs began to subside, and he trusted himself to climb back down the tree. He went home. He hadn't even gotten to the driveway before his parents were at the kitchen door. Ellen Carver stood on the stoop, hand raised to her forehead to shade her eyes. Well, Ralph almost ran down to the sidewalk to meet him and grab him by the shoulder. "Where were you? Where in hell were you, David?" "I went for a walk into the Bear Street woods. I was thinking about Brian." "Well, you scared the devil out of us," his mom said. Kirsten joined her on the stoop. She was eating a bowl of Jell-O and had her favorite doll, Melissa's sweetheart, tucked under her arm. "Even Kirsty was worried, weren't you?" "Nope," Pi said, and went on eating her Jell-O. "Are you all right?" his father had asked. "Yes." "Are you sure?" "Yes." He went into the house, yanking on one of Pi's braids as he went past her. Pi wrinkled her nose at him and smiled. "Supper's almost ready. Go wash up," Ellen said. The telephone started to ring. She went to answer it, then called sharply to David as he headed for the downstairs bathroom to wash his hands, which had been pretty dirty, sticky, sappy, tree-climbing dirty. He turned and saw his mom holding out the telephone in one fist, while she twisted the other restlessly in her apron. She tried to talk, but at first no sound came out. When her lips moved, she swallowed and tried again. "It's Debbie Ross for you. She's crying. I think it must be over. For gosh sakes, be kind to her." David crossed the room and took the phone. That feeling of otherness had swept over him again. He had been sure his mom was at least half right. Something was over. "Hello," he said, "Mrs. Ross." She was crying so hard that at first she couldn't talk. She tried, but what came through her sobs was just wah, wah, wah. From a little distance he heard Mr. Ross say, "Let me do it." And Mrs. Ross said, "No, I'm okay." There was a mighty honk in David's ear. It sounded like a hungry goose. And then she said, "Brian's awake." "Is he?" David said. What she had just said made him feel happier than he had ever been in his life, and yet it had not surprised him at all. "Is he dead?" Ellen was mouthing at him. One hand was still plunged deep in her apron, twisting and turning. "No," David said, putting his hand over the mouthpiece to talk to his mother and father. It was all right. He could do that. Debbie Ross was sobbing again. He thought she'd do that every time she told anyone, at least for a while. She wouldn't be able to help it because her heart had given him up. "Is he dead?" Ellen mouthed again. "No," he told her, a little irritated. It was like she was deaf. "Not dead, alive. She says he's awake." His mother and father gaped like fish in an aquarium. Pi went past them, still eating Jell-O. Her face turned down to the face of her doll, which was sticking stiffly out from the crook of her arm. "Told you this would happen," she said to Melissa's sweetheart, in a forbidding, this closes the discussion tone of voice. "Didn't I say so?" "Awake," David's mother had said in a stunned, musing voice. "Alive." "David, are you there?" Mrs. Ross asked. "Yes," he said, "right here." "About 20 minutes after you left, the EEG monitor started to show waves. I saw them first. Mark was down in the caf getting sodas, and I went to the nurse's station. They didn't believe me." She laughed through her tears. "Well, of course, who would? And when I finally got someone to come look, they called maintenance instead of a doctor. That's how sure they were that it couldn't be happening. They actually replaced the monitor. Isn't that the most amazing thing you ever heard?" "Yes," David said. "Wow." Both parents were mouthing at him now, and his dad was also making big hand gestures. To David, he looked like an insane asylum inmate who thought he was a game show host. That made him want to laugh. He didn't want to do that while he was on the phone. Mrs. Ross wouldn't understand, so he turned and faced the wall. It wasn't until they saw the same high waves on the new monitor, only even stronger, that one of the nurses called Dr. Wisłowski. He's the neurologist. Before he got here, Brian opened his eyes and looked around at us. He asked me if I'd fed the goldfish today. I said yes. The goldfish were fine. I didn't cry or anything. I was too stunned to cry. Then he said his head ached and closed his eyes again. When Dr. Wisłowski came in, Brian looked like he was still in the coma, and I saw him give the nurse a look like, "Why do you bother me with this? You know?" "Sure," David said. But when the doctor clapped his hands beside Brian's ear, he opened his eyes again right away. You should have seen that old Polak's face. "Davy," she laughed. That old Polak's face, Davy, she laughed. The cackling laugh of a mad woman. Then Brian said he was thirsty and asked if he could have a drink of water. She broke down entirely then, her sobs so loud in his ear that they almost hurt. Then they faded, and Bry's dad said, "David, you still there?" He sounded none too steady himself, but he wasn't outright bawling, which was a relief. "Sure." Brian doesn't remember the accident, doesn't remember anything after doing his homework in his room. the night before it happened, but he remembers his name and his address and our names. He knows who the president is, and he can do simple math problems. Dr. Wasuski says he's heard of cases like this, but never actually seen one. He called it a clinical miracle. I don't know if that actually means anything or if it's just something he's always wanted to say, and I don't care. I just want to thank you, David. So does Debbie. From the bottom of our hearts. Me? David asked. A hand was tugging his shoulder, trying to get him to turn around. He resisted it. What are you thanking me for? For bringing Brian back to us? You were talking to him. The waves started showing up just after you left. He heard you, Davy. He heard you and came back. It wasn't me, David said. He turned around. His folks were all but looming over him, their faces frantic with hope, amazement, confusion. His mother was crying. What a day for tears it had been. Only Pi, who usually bawled at least 6 hours of every 24, seemed to have her shit together. I know what I know, Mr. Ross said. I know what I know, David. He had to talk to his parents before they stared at him so hard they set his shirt on fire. But before he did, there was one other thing he had to know. What time did he wake up and ask about his goldfish? How long after he started seeing his brainwaves? Well, they changed the monitor, she told you that, and then, I don't know. He trailed off for a moment, then said, yes, I do. I remember hearing the Columbus Broad fire whistle just before everything happened, so it must have been a few minutes past 5. David had nodded, unsurprised, right around the time the voice in his head had told him, you're praying already. Can I come and see him tomorrow? Mr. Ross had laughed then. David, you can come and see him at midnight if that's what you want. Why not? Dr. Wasuski says we have to keep waking him up anyway and asking him stupid questions. I know what he's afraid of, that Brian will slip back into the coma, but I don't think that's going to happen. Do you? Nope, David said. Bye, Mr. Ross. He had hung up the telephone then, and his parents all but pounced on him. How did it happen? They wanted to know, how did it happen? And what do they think you had to do with it? David felt an urge then, an amazingly strong one, to cast his eyes down modestly and say, what? He woke up. That's really all I know, except, well, he would pause with seeming reluctance and add, Mr. and Mrs. Ross, think he might have heard my voice and responded to it. But you know how upset they've been. That's all it would take to start a legend. Part of him knew it, and he wanted to do it. Part of him really, really wanted to do it. It wasn't the strange inside-out voice that stopped him, but a thought of his own, one that was more intuitive than articulated. If you take the credit, it stops here. What stops? Everything that matters, the voice of intuition responded. Everything that matters. David, come on, his father said, giving his shoulders a little shake. We're dying here. Brian's awake, he said, choosing his words carefully. He can talk, he can remember. The brain guy says it's a miracle. Mr. and Mrs. Ross think I had something to do with it. That he heard me talking to him and came back. But nothing like that happened. I was holding his hand and he wasn't there. He was the most gone person I ever saw in my life. That's why I cried, not because his folks were having a fit, but because he was gone. I don't know what happened, and I don't care. He's awake. That's all I care about. That's all you need to care about, darling, his mother said and gave him a brief hard hug. I'm hungry, he said. What's for dinner? Section 3. Now he hung in the black, blind but not deaf, listening for the voice, the one Reverend Jean Martin called the still, small voice of God. Reverend Martin had listened carefully to David's story, not once but many times, over the last 7 months, and he seemed especially pleased by David's recounting of how he had felt during the conversation with his parents after he had finished talking with Mr. Ross. Side note, I've been reading this chapter for a really long time. I'm gonna break for now and finish it later. So, chapter 5, section 3.